2020 continues to give us new experiences. Today is a special day in the life of St. Cuthbert's, but of course being 2020, we are experiencing this special day in a new way, in a different kind of a way this year, in a very 2020 kind of a way. A bit like anybody who was due to have any kind of major celebration this year, the plans have had to change. I'm sure I've said already this year that Sarah's major birthday, my dad's major birthday, has had to look different to what it was supposed to look like, what the plans were earlier on in the year. And so too we celebrate St. Cuthbert's, the patron saint of this church, St. Cuthbert's Church, in a very different way. Thankfully, for those who are able to attend, we can still have a service, albeit looking a little bit different to what it might have done. But sadly, there are, of course, a number of people who are not able to join us, either that be our regular congregation or our Methodist brothers and sisters who would normally join us for worship on this particular day of the year. And so all of this got me thinking, what is God saying to us through this situation that we find ourselves in? And more specifically, how would God speak to and use St. Cuthbert if it were to happen to him? Now, St. Cuthbert wouldn't have lived through a global pandemic in quite the way that we have, because people didn't travel globally in the way that we do today. I've no idea if he lived through a localized pandemic or health crisis, given the levels of awareness of germs and infections in his day. He was born in Northumbria in about 635. I imagine that he saw at least some significant health issues impact those that he knew. For St. Cuthbert, his life was changed when he was about 17 years old, whilst he was looking after some neighbours' sheep in the hills, and it was there that he had a vision where he saw Aidan, who was the founder of Lindisfarne Priory. He saw Aidan being carried up to heaven, and then it was later that he found out that Aidan had died on that night. Now, stained glass windows are full of little clues from the person's life. And our stained glass window that you find in St. Cuthbert's, you see St. Cuthbert looking up. And so what that is a reference to this vision that he had, and the consequences of that vision he could not possibly have predicted. And so I wonder if you had had a similar experience, what you think that the consequences would be. What it led to for St. Cuthbert was a monastic life. It led to also a number of years living as a hermit. It also led to a short time as a bishop. Initially, of course, it led to a monastic life, but he couldn't have possibly have known what lay beyond that first response in joining the monastic life. We too have gone through something that we didn't know was going to happen. No one could have possibly predicted the consequences of COVID-19 when we first heard about it. As an example of this, there's a trend on social media at the moment to post a picture of yourself from January of this year, that moment when you were blissfully unaware of what this year was going to look like. I wonder what you were doing in January, blissfully unaware of what was going to happen. But this pattern of changing moments or events should not come as a surprise to us, because as we look through the history books of Christians down the years, with St. Cuthbert of course being just one example, but also because of the many examples that we see in the life of the Bible, today's gospel gives us an example of one of these life-changing moments. We also have, of course, an example of someone having a vision, a bit like St. Cuthbert. In our first reading, but I'll come to that in a few minutes. That was also a life-changing moment. So the disciples, when they first met Jesus, they were blissfully unaware of what would happen, of the direction that their life would take having met with Jesus. And so what we see in the reading is that when Jesus was teaching and the crowd were pressing in on him, he, as a result, got into Simon's boat to get away from this pressing crowd, and Simon had no idea what was going to happen. And what we discover is that he, perhaps reluctantly, he agreed to put his fishing nets into the deep water because Jesus, this non-fisherman, had asked him to, despite having not caught anything all night. Now, if you were a professional fisherman, you haven't caught anything all night, and someone that you had never met had told you to put your nets back into the water, would you do it? Perhaps the disciples' reaction is desperation. After all, they haven't caught anything all night. Perhaps their reaction is just humouring Jesus. Perhaps they respected who Jesus was and the position that he held. Perhaps they'd heard about what Jesus had been doing. Perhaps these stories of his miracles were beginning to spread. But this was still very early in the life and ministry of Jesus. So maybe that hadn't happened. But whatever the reason, that Simon, James and John had for doing what he asked, they were absolutely astonished at what happened. They caught so many fish that their nets began to break. And so what we see is Jesus performing a miracle right in front of their eyes with something that they knew a lot about, that really, really captured their attention. Who was this man? Who was it who could do this amazing miracle right in front of their eyes with something that they really understood and captured their attention? But these kind of experiences, what we know is that they don't always lead to a radical change in someone's life. I have known people have very dramatic experiences of God whose life has changed completely, and they have become lifelong followers of Jesus. Some even give their life to sharing that particular story, that moment of encounter with others. They've given their life to that. And yet others have had similar dramatic encounters, but their life didn't change. God has the ability to impact our life in very unexpected ways, and we can be surprised by that chance moment, that particular experience, but we are the ones who have to respond. We are given that choice, that free will, which is why you see these examples of people either responding in a way that means that they follow Jesus for the rest of their life, or people who seemingly just carry on as if nothing has happened. The first reading is Paul recounting his road to Damascus encounter with Jesus. So Paul was a man renowned for his persecution of the early church, and he had met with the risen Jesus as he travelled to a place called Damascus. And of course, in that moment, and the consequence of that is that he could have just ignored that divine revelation, carried on with his life, carried on killing Christians, but he didn't. He responded by becoming one of the most important early Christians, and so we still read about his life and his writings today. And so with all of this, with all these different examples, what we see is that moments in life can have huge consequences, far beyond what we expect at the time, far beyond just that moment. And with these moments, God can use them to do very unexpected things in our lives. And so whilst you may not think that COVID-19 is in the same category as St. Cuthbert's vision, or the disciples' experience of Jesus' miracle, or Paul's road to Damascus experience, it is a significant moment in time nonetheless. Our world is very unlikely, or it will not return to its pre-COVID-19 ways. As we know, many things have already changed. Shops and businesses have gone out of business, they've gone forever. Some things have moved online, the way that certain professions work will probably not be the same again. And so throughout our experiences of this time, I wonder, have you stopped to ask the question of what God is saying to you or to us through this? Not just spending the time in doom and gloom or being concerned about the government's response, both of which would be very easy, but having asked, prayed about that question of what God might be saying through this time, what lessons we might learn, what encouragement we might give to someone else. I wonder if you have shared any of those thoughts or senses or feelings or prayers with someone else. Because without a doubt, this time is going to shape us as a community, as a church community. It has and will impact on our relationships with each other, with our finances, our worship, our community activities, our discipleship, our prayer, to name a few. And so we need the encouragement and support of each other, and we need that reminder that God is still with us and guiding us to whatever comes next. And so whatever the circumstances that we face, whether it is COVID-19 or something else entirely, we always need to be ready for what God will do amongst us. Despite our current situation, we need to be open to where God is leading us so that we are ready to respond. And so even though we journey through challenging times, God is with us. He can still surprise us with what is around the corner. And so are we like the disciples, like Paul, like St. Cuthbert, ready to follow the call of God and be taken in new and unexpected directions?